What's up, everybody? It is the Best Spot Kid Smooth, and I'm back with another video. And today we're going to be discussing the Xbox Series X and S and a ton of features that's built into these machines that aren't being used. And I'm doing this video because as more games have been coming out, you think of games like Elden Ring, Dying Light, just a ton of games that come out, and you find them either running at like 30 FPS on the Xbox Series S, dropping frames on the Series X, and we're like kind of just have to rely on VR, which is a great feature, but it's like VR is something you really want if you're playing at really like high frame rates, because there's not going to be a game that completely locks to 120 frames per second. So VR just helps that smooth, because people be playing PC, they play games at like they never play at a locked frame rate. They play at high frame rates, but never a locked frame rate. So that's why things like VR and FreeSync is pretty good. You don't see any sort of jutters or to fill those drops when the game is running that fast. So VR is clutch for Xbox, but the thing is that it's really, you really want a VR when you're playing at above 60 FPS. Not to say that it doesn't work for 60 FPS, but its primary use is because you're not going to lock a game at 120 frames per second. There's a select few games that obviously will do that, but typically any game running above 60 FPS, that's when VR is clutch, and you don't have to lock the frame rate when you're above 60 FPS. So but let's get to this video and why I'm doing it, right? So I just want to talk about the Xbox Series X and S technology glossary, and what you're going to find here. You're going to find this really crazy that there's a ton of features we're going to see in this list that has not been used yet, or used very sparsely, and likely only by first-party developers. So first, we're going to talk about auto HDR is used. Now, there's things that are at a system level that's going to be used automatically just by default. Auto HDR is one of those things, is that no developer input, the Xbox is just going to do it. Like, it is what it is. You know what I mean? That's a part of, I guess, machine learning that the system does, where it can literally detect the colors and create HDR out of an image that never had HDR or never was intended for HDR. So let's go about that. All right, so HDR, we know, is a thing. Auto low latency mode, like I said, that's literally at system settings, so that's like kind of automatic. Developers don't have to really worry about that, especially nowadays with these games with high frame rates and stuff like that. The Xbox, with the system level things that the Xbox does, like auto HDR and auto latency, low latency mode and stuff like that, these are just good features that require no additional work from the developer. Same thing, backwards compatibility. Now, this is literally one of Xbox's best features, because we get to play Xbox 360, and Xbox One games, and we get to play them at better resolutions, better frame rates. We already seen examples of FPS boosts. This is the reason why Xbox has the most games running at 60 and 120 frames this gen. We've already seen examples of resolution boosts. There's games like Cameo Elements of Power running at 4K 60 right now. Elder Scrolls Oblivion, Fallout 3, those are running at like higher resolutions along with higher frame rates. So that, like I said, there's no really developer needed for backwards compatibility. Xbox been on a backwards compatibility train since 2015, and I don't foresee that changing in the near future. Okay, DirectML. Now, this is one of the first features we're gonna come across that hasn't been used by any developer, third parties, completely ignored. And a lot of these features that we're about to read and talk about are features that are literally made to enhance performance, or performance saving features, to allow games to run at its native resolutions, to allow games to run at its native resolutions as well as high frame rates. DirectML, it says Xbox Series X and Series S supports machine learning for games with DirectML, a component of DirectX, which is, DirectX ML leverages unprecedented hardware performance in a console, with Xbox Series X benefiting from over 24 teraflops of 16-bit float performance. And none of that shit. I don't know what it means. It's a bunch of math. But let's dumb it down. Machine learning can improve a wide range of areas, such as making NPCs much smarter, providing vastly more lifelike animations, and greatly improving visual quality. I can tell you right now that it's not being used because we still get dumb AI. Frame rates are still dropping, and dynamic resolutions are still more used than native resolutions, which DirectML, based on its description, could have solved a lot of problems for fucking Elden Ring and Dying Light 2. Direct storage. Now, this is... when I read this, I'm like, come on, bro, really? So direct storage is really pretty much the SSD. You know, the biggest thing about the PS5 is the SSD, super fast, the decompression techniques, all this other stuff. This is part of Xbox Velocity architecture, which as a whole doesn't get used. Asset streaming. I can tell you direct storage isn't used for the simple fact of most games still have pop-in, like visible pop-in that you can see. Direct storage literally in its description is to eliminate that. Like visual pop-in, when the world's loaded in the distance you see things popping in. Halo Infinite could have used direct storage. Serious Sam 4 could have used direct storage. Assassin's Creed Valhalla could have used direct storage. The asset streaming. This was like the biggest thing on the PS5, but both PS5 and Series X, and then obviously Series S have games, that's, still suffer from popping. And direct storage is based on its description, is pretty much supposed to alleviate that and reduce overhead for things like for the CPU workload, so allow you to maintain those frame rates and allowing you to retain a lot of CPU related stuff if you are utilizing direct storage. Dynamic latency input, that's system level. GPU work creation. Okay. GPU work creation, I can tell you it's not being used. This is literally a tool that allows developers to pretty much go all in on graphics and to ensure that their CPU, the CPU isn't being put to work when they're using this GPU workstation. So that means, how there's games that are CPU heavy, their worlds are like, they're just games that CPU heavy, and you got games that are GPU heavy, and then they do the little graphics test and they show the frame rate, and they're trying to point out bottlenecks and all this other shit. Oh, well, this is a GPU heavy. GPU work creation. It's there for them to use. So shit like that doesn't happen. So excuses like that doesn't happen. Xbox, before I continue on, Xbox literally has a solution for every problem we see come up in video game tests. Low pop-in, frame rates, screen tearing, ray tracing, what else? Like install size. They literally have a solution for every last one of these issues, and they have yet to be used. DirectX ray tracing, hardware accelerated ray tracing. Now, I don't know what it is, but so the Xbox literally has ray tracing cores built into it. PlayStation, so far from a software standpoint, has more impressive ray trace games. There's ray tracing games on Xbox, but PlayStation has a lot more first party games taking advantage of ray tracing. There are some third party games that utilize ray tracing on Xbox. It's just very spotty. I don't know what's the best example of it. The best example of ray tracing that I would say is on Xbox. I usually don't utilize ray tracing on Xbox because it's usually associated with 30 FPS, which means it shouldn't happen based on some of the stuff that Xbox has to allow for its optimizations. So, but I typically don't use ray tracing. Like right now, like Grand Theft Auto, they have performance ray tracing, which is ray tracing plus 60 FPS. I'm playing with that mode because I'll take the, the extra, light bouncing and reflections, with the 60 FPS. But so far, I don't know if DirectX ray tracing is. Obviously, it's not as good as the ray tracing that you find with NVIDIA, and so there's a difference in quality of what you get there. I'm no tech expert there, but based on there, like there's some good examples like of ray tracing. Like I like the other example of ray tracing, ray trace shadows, ray trace like audio, or they'll do like ray trace, like they'll do different things that involve ray tracing that brings the game to life. Everybody look at ray tracing and just assume it's just reflections, but that's just one portion of it. But like I know Doom Eternal utilizes ray tracing on the Series X. I think Gears 5 is utilizing a software ray tracing solution. What else? Game, I think the Medium, but it was a weak form of ray tracing. I think Control had ray tracing, but it was a weak form of ray tracing as well. But we'll see. But it's obviously not being used enough because there's only a small percentage of games that have access to ray tracing. Hardware decompression. Now, this is literally the answer to PlayStation's Kraken. Developers feel entitled to use PlayStation's Kraken. They feel entitled. They'll make sure a game is 50% smaller on PlayStation and be big as whatever on Xbox for no reason at all. They have a solution. Actually, they have multiple ways to get smaller install size on Xbox. They have multiple methods. One of them is hardware decompression. Hardware decompression is a dedicated hardware component introduced with the Xbox Series X and S to allow games to consume as little space as possible on the SSD while eliminating all CPU overhead typically associated with runtime decompression. It reduces software overhead when operating at full SSD performance from more than 3 CPU cores. We don't care, right? Improve frame rates, all that stuff. Okay. There's another thing. So hardware decompression, BC, I think there's also this thing called BC pack or something like that. That's also supposed to make files smaller. Intelligent delivery. Now, this is different from smart delivery. Smart delivery is automatic. It just works. So that's, shout out to, I don't even think developers, they just have to agree to sell one copy to the game to all Xbox users. Essentially, that's what smart delivery is. But intelligent delivery is another source on the development side. Let's read this. Microsoft developer facing technology to reduce the size of a game. Once again, hardware decompression can help with that. And intelligent delivery. Now, this one attacks it directly head on. The goal of intelligent delivery is to reduce the size of game installs. Intelligent delivery empowers developers to only install pieces of the game you need, thereby minimizing the amount of content that needs to be installed or downloaded on the SSD. They don't use it, though. They don't use it. They don't freaking use it. They don't use it. Honestly, this is how it should be, right? If you live, I live in North America, right? You get like a Madden or a sports game, and they have all these different languages loaded. That's probably half the game install size right there. Those need to be optional. Optional. Don't make that an option. Reduce the game size by freaking 20% by doing just that. But intelligent delivery, developers have access to this. They're not using it, right? They're obviously not using it because games are still bigger on Xbox for no apparent reason. And then when games are the same, like when there's a miniature install size difference between PlayStation and Xbox, that's because Xbox, the developers aren't using Kraken. Latency. That's used, so we're not going to talk about mesh shading. Mesh shading will enable developers to dramatically improve performance and image quality when rendering substantial number of complex objects in a scene. As an example, mesh shaders could enable players to experience an asteroid belts and fields of flowers in more pristine detail without seeing loss in performance. Now, I'm going to say this. If anybody's using mesh shading, it had to be Playground, because that Forza Horizon 5 still to this day looks mind-blowing, and the foliage and everything. There's nothing comes close right now. But mesh shading obviously is not used, at least not enough. But mesh shading is like I don't want to say it's a form. It's like VRS. It allows you to maintain the quality you're targeting, and without like utilizing the pretty much without like pretty much hammering down the console's like raw power. You know what I mean? Pretty much allowing you to work efficiently. Mesh shading literally is targeting graphic capability, doing what you want visually and doing it, and then you use that with VRS and achieving that at the resolution you're targeting. Native resolutions. Now this is used. We know Xbox can do native 4K. It's actually being used. Some people will lazy development. They'll make the game native 4K and not optimize around its performance, and this is how Xbox will end up games at native 4K and stuttering frame rate with no other features used to maintain 60 FPS or more. Cooling acoustics, don't really care. RDNA 2, that's not being used on either PlayStation 5 or Series X, unless it's an Xbox a Series X exclusive. A lot of games that 90% of the games we're playing right now, if they're cross-gen, they're literally running. It's like we have a boosted version of the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro when we're playing these games. If there's no concrete version or difference between the last gen and the next gen, like for example, I feel like Dying Light, we're getting Xbox One X Plus version of the game. We're getting Elden Ring, Xbox One X Plus version of the game. These games are not taking advantage of the hardware. These literally, like Dying Light 2 and Elden Ring, legit have issues. Xbox literally have an answer for their unique ass issues. Literally have an answer for their unique ass issues. They can't do it. Like Dying Light, the guys that over at Techland can't seem to work with dynamic resolutions. It just doesn't work. They can't handle it. They can't handle dynamic resolutions. So they work at fixed resolutions. It is what it is. That's like why you got games like freaking Dying Light fixed at like 1080p on the Series X and PS5 to run at 60 frames per second. Well, it just got updated on the Series X to 1296p at 60 frames and then 1080p at 60 plus FPS, right? But there's still so much headroom, and not even counting the shit that they don't use, right? And then you got Elden Ring. So I said Techland, they don't know how to handle dynamic resolutions. From Software can't handle a lock frame rate. They just can't. It's just their frame pacing, their frame times, it's just something they was never 20 years in the game, they just couldn't figure it out. And there's legit tech tools they have access to achieve the frame rate they want and to achieve the resolutions they want and the image quality you want. You know what I think about Elden Ring? I know I've been playing a ton of it. I think the reason why the game, you know what? It's all down to performance. I think the game's difficulty is tied to its bad frame pacing and just being an uneven performing game. I think that's what really makes its difficulty. I think that's what I guarantee you now, people aren't having problems with Demon Souls beating that game, right? Because it performs okay. It performs okay, so it's not much of a challenge. Put From Software back on the game with its uneven frames, the game's gonna be 10 times harder. I think that's really the cause of that. Sampler feedback streaming. Yeah, that's not being used. I can tell you that right now. It's just not being used. Anything that has anything to do with Xbox Velocity architecture is just not being used. Smart delivery is used by 80% of the games we buy typically. So there's more games using smart delivery than not. Teraflops, VRS. I think 2 or 3 studios use VRS. I think Halo Infinite used it, but very poorly. Gears 5 and Gears Tactics on the Series X used it, and they used it masterfully. And Doom Eternal, the Series X and the S version, used it because they're also utilizing ray tracing. So they kind of got the memo. They was like, hey, we can do ray tracing at 60 FPS. And we can have the resolutions above 1080p. So yes, Doom Eternal on Series X runs at 60 FPS with ray tracing above 1080p, and they managed to do 120 FPS at above 1080p. So, and they use VRS. They use VRS on Series X. In the result, you know what happened? The result, they're able to get higher resolutions on the Series X than they do on the PS5 in their enhanced versions. The PS5 version, not to say that PS5 version is any bad, but the Series X version of Doom, it's able to maintain high resolutions, I believe, in all modes, and is able, I know in 120 hertz modes, is able to maintain a higher frame rate. They've actually used some of the shit that's in the Xbox. But other than that, I don't know anybody else who's used variable rate shading, which, when you consider that, you look at the Xbox Series S, like a lot of this stuff I think about the Xbox Series S is like, there's no way Xbox Series X, based on what's built into that system, even though it's a cheap console and it's designed to do 1440p 60, thinking about it, they really should be achieving 1440p 60 in most games. 1080p 60, 1440. The thing is, we've seen them do it. We've seen some games run 1440p 60, and Dement, like Far Cry 6, is not an ugly game. We've seen games at 120. We've seen games at 4K on a Series S. Like it's ridiculous. So the Series S is literally being like kind of handicapped here. VR. This is now VR, once again, it's a system level thing. It's kind of one of the best features available on Xbox right now, because developers, literally, it's allowing developers to get away with, shipping their game with, spotty performance. Because if you have a VR capable TV, a lot of times you're not going to know if your game is freaking dropping a frame. You're probably not going to know it. If the frames aren't bad, like you get a drop here and there, it's not bad, you're not going to notice it. But and it evens out gameplay. I mean, you gotta, it's a saving grace. But the thing is, right, the intent for VRR, right, is typically mainly for higher latency, higher frame rates. And when I say higher frame rates, higher than 60. This is really meant for if you're playing at games that are above 60 FPS. Like games like Dying Light, if you're constantly getting between 80 or 90, VRR is going to come in clutch. It's going to come in clutch. It's not going to feel bad at like 80 frames per second. But the thing is, if you have a game like if you have a game like freaking Dying Light or Devil May Cry 5, which runs at unlocked frame rates all the way, and it's typically all above like 60, you're gonna be all right. That's what VRR is mainly for. But when you look at games like running that's targeting 60 FPS, the Xbox Series X and Series S, and even the PS5 should be like kind of like just hitting that target all the time. And the Xbox has a ton of tech for those odd one-off when there's something's hitting the GPU just a little bit too hard, something's hitting the CPU a little bit too hard. They have these just in case solutions that are never used. They're not being used. And maybe we have to wait for next generation only games, but it sucks that it's not being used, because Xbox literally, in these graphic comparisons, these performance comparisons, have these unnecessary like results, and they have stuff in the system that literally should rule that null and void. But that's just my thoughts on this. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button. I'm a little bit exhausted. But let me know if you guys agree. What's up, man? Why are third parties sleeping on Xbox and not utilizing this stuff? All right, it's either one thing. Couple options, a couple things that could be going on. Most developers are PlayStation fanboys. 2, developers don't have access to this stuff, maybe. Or developers are still making cross-gen games, so they just don't feel like it's worth the time utilizing this stuff. But this is why I'm looking at id, Machine Games, Coalition, Playground, 343. Every Xbox first-party studio got to hit the ground running with this tech, because there should not be any parity, honestly. If you read this list of things that the Xbox has and what their capabilities are, there should be no parity. There should be no parity. Nothing should be close. And the Xbox Series S should be punching way above its weight. So in some cases, the Xbox Series S is punching above its weight, but more often than not, it's punching it's punching at last gen's weight, and I feel like that's at more so on the fault of the devs and not utilizing what it has. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. See you guys on the next video. As always, Xbox is the best box. I am the best bot. This is a long video. I apologize, but hey. Hey.